She probably drove him to it. That is what Daniel Mercer's mother said to the 23 people gathered in her living room, 8 days after I buried an empty casket. My name is Clara Mercer. I was 31 years old when my husband disappeared into the Allegheny River on a Tuesday morning in October. I am 42 now. And the reason I can say his mother's words out loud without my voice breaking, the reason any of this is worth telling, is because of what I found in a storage unit in Canonsburg, Pennsylvania, on a cold afternoon 11 years later. He was not dead. He had never been dead. And by the time I learned that, I had already made sure the entire world knew it too. If this story sounds like something you need to hear in full, stay with me. I want to know what you take from it when it's done. The house I grew up in smelled like dryer sheets and Campbell's tomato soup, and the particular mustiness of carpet that had absorbed 17 years of a family's ordinary life. My mother, Renata Vasquez, kept that house in Greensburg, Pennsylvania, the way some women keep their promises, with a quiet, stubborn dedication that nobody thanked her for. She worked double shifts at the hospital laundry on the weeks my father's paycheck came up short, which was more weeks than not. She never complained. She just moved through the kitchen at 5:30 in the morning with her hair still pressed flat on one side, making lunches and not making excuses. I learned what love looked like from watching her. I learned what sacrifice looked like from watching her. I did not learn, until much later, how to recognize when someone was using both of those things against me. I met Daniel Mercer at a birthday party for a mutual friend in the spring of 2001. He was 27. I was 22. He had dark hair that curled slightly at the collar of his jacket, and a way of listening to you talk that made you feel like you were the only person in a crowded room. He asked questions. He remembered the answers. He called when he said he would call. These things felt like miracles to a 22-year-old who had dated boys who did none of them. We were married in June of 2003. The reception was at the Keystone Commons Banquet Hall outside of Greensburg. 81 guests. My dress had cost $640, which I paid for myself because my father's health had deteriorated by then, and my mother had other things to manage. I remember standing in the hotel bathroom at 11:15 that night, slipping off my heels and pressing my bare feet against the cool tile floor, thinking that this was the beginning of everything, that nothing bad could reach me here. I was not naive. I was just young, which is a different thing. Though the consequences can be identical, Daniel and I moved to Bridgeville, a southwestern suburb of Pittsburgh, where he took a position as a regional sales manager for a commercial flooring company called Target Surface Solutions. The job paid $71,000 a year. I worked as a medical billing coordinator for a multi-specialty clinic in Carnegie and earned $44,000. We bought a beige Colonial on Oakdale Road in 2005 for $214,000. We had a silver Toyota Camry, a dog named Biscuit, and a budget spreadsheet Daniel kept on a yellow legal pad that I thought was charming and would later understand differently. The detective placed a hand on his arm. He stood. Susan Mercer, Susan Kowalski, the woman who had believed herself to be a widow's consolation prize and had unknowingly become a crime's accessory, was seated next to him. She looked up at the detective. She looked at her husband. The expression on her face in that moment was not one I can be unkind about. It was the expression of a woman who understood, in the span of a few seconds, that her life was also about to be reorganized by information she had not been given. In a room of 220 people, the noise level dropped perceptibly. Not to silence, to the specific frequency of people who are trying to hear something they have not been told they're allowed to hear. Daniel was escorted from the room. I stood up. I walked to the Allied Interior Solutions table. Susan was still seated. 3 of Daniel's colleagues were on their feet, looking at each other, and then at me, and then at the door, through which Daniel had just left. I looked at Susan Kowalski. I am not proud of every feeling I had in that moment, because she was also a victim of this. And I knew that. And I had known it since Maggie had first shown me her photograph in 2013. I said to her, quietly, "My name is Clara Mercer. I've been his wife since 2003. You'll be hearing from attorneys." Then I walked back to my table, picked up my coat, and walked out of the William Penn Hotel. Maggie was waiting by the car. She had her thermos. She offered it to me. I said, "Is that coffee?" She said, "It's always coffee." I took it. The legal proceedings moved through the Allegheny County court system across 2022 and into 2023, with a particular pace of institutions that are thorough rather than fast. On the criminal side, Daniel was charged in April 2022 with bigamy under 18 pascals. CS 4301. Identity fraud and theft by deception. His attorney argued that the identity fraud charge was technically weak. He had used a legal variant of his actual name, not a fabricated identity, and the judge agreed to reduce that charge. The bigamy charge was not reducible. He pled guilty in November 2022 and was sentenced in February 2023 to 18 months of probation, 200 hours of community service, and a fine of $12,500. He did not serve prison time, a fact that I will be honest with you about. I was angry about. Patricia told me the absence of prior criminal record and the absence of a life insurance fraud made incarceration unlikely. And she was right. I accepted it. On the civil side, Judge Miriam Caldwell presided over a settlement conference in January 2023. Daniel's civil attorney had a considerably more difficult position than the criminal defense attorney because of David Chung's certified financial documentation. The $189,400 in documented, redirected marital assets, with 11 years of legal rate interest, produced a base claim of $263,000. Patricia also argued for damages under intentional infliction of emotional distress, a harder claim to quantify, but she submitted documentation of the grief counseling I had undertaken in 2014 and 2015, records of the legal and investigative costs I had incurred, totaling $57,800 in attorney and PI fees over 11 years, and an expert witness deposition from a clinical psychologist who described the documented psychological impact of prolonged, false bereavement. The case settled out of court on March 4, 2023. The settlement amount was $312,000. The funds were to be paid in 2 installments over 18 months. The first installment of $156,000 arrived on April 22, 2023. I am told the second installment arrived on schedule in October of that year, though by then I had moved the money into an index fund and was paying it very little daily attention. The 2018 death certificate was formally vacated by the Allegheny County Court on June 7, 2022. I received a letter confirming this. I put it in the same file folder where I had kept, for 11 years, a copy of the yellow legal pad note with 11 words on it. Then I filed the folder in the back of a cabinet. The Allied Interior Solutions Company terminated Daniel's employment in April 2022, immediately following his arrest. He subsequently lost the Whitfield Drive house through a combination of civil asset attachment and, according to records Maggie continued to track through 2023, his inability to maintain the mortgage as a solo income without Susan, who had filed for annulment of their marriage in June 2022 on the grounds of fraud and legal impossibility. She had married a man who was legally married to someone else. Her annulment was granted. Keith and Tracy Mercer issued a brief written statement through their family attorney in May 2022, acknowledging that they had been aware of certain financial arrangements Daniel had discussed with Keith in the years before 2012, but had not understood them to constitute fraud. Maggie had found, through the LLC documentation, that Keith had served briefly as a registered agent for Mercer Consulting Group. Patricia advised me that Keith's exposure to civil liability was real, but difficult to prove given the limited documentary evidence of his direct knowledge. I made the decision not to include Keith in the civil action. That decision was not forgiveness. It was a calculation about where to spend my energy, and I stand by it. Gerald Mercer died in January 2023, in the middle of the civil proceedings. I sent a condolence card to the family. I felt it was the appropriate thing to do for an old man who had not, as far as I knew, been part of his son's deception. I do not know if the card was received with warmth. Nadine did not apologize. Nadine did not contact me at any point during the criminal proceedings, the civil proceedings, or after. I understand this. She had organized her understanding of the world around the protection of her son. And no court order, and no financial settlement, and no bigamy conviction was going to reorganize that. Some people have made themselves so certain of their narrative that the facts become irrelevant to them. Nadine was one of those people. I made my peace with that because my peace was not dependent on her participation. I would be lying if I said I thought about her often by the end of 2023. I did not. I thought about her less than she deserved, which was the kindest form of justice I could offer. There is a question I have been asked, in various forms, by various people who know this story, which is, how did you spend 11 years, not knowing, and not losing your mind? The honest answer is that the not knowing and the keeping going were never in conflict for me. I had Maggie's investigation as the ongoing structure of the hope that I was right. I had my work, which had grown into something I was genuinely proud of. I had my mother, who in 2013, when I finally told her everything, held my hands across her kitchen table and said, I always felt something was wrong in that marriage, and I never said so, and I'm sorry. I had a therapist named Dr. Carol Inman, whom I saw every 2 weeks from 2014 through 2017, and who gave me the cognitive scaffolding to understand that grief and suspicion could coexist without one invalidating the other. I had the kind of friendships that are built in the aftermath of a catastrophe. Not the friendships that require good weather to survive, but the ones that show up in the parking lot, with a thermos of coffee, when the thing you've been waiting for finally happens. I lost 11 years of a life I had expected to live. I did not get those years back. The civil settlement did not buy them back. Nothing will. What I gained is harder to catalog because it is not the kind of thing you can list on a legal pad. I gained the knowledge that I can endure more than I thought, which is not a gift I asked for but which has proven useful. I gained a complete, documented, legally certified understanding of exactly what was done to me, which is more than most people who are deceived ever get. I gained the experience of watching the truth behave the way truth behaves when you give it enough time and enough patience and one very good private investigator, which is to say, it surfaces. It always surfaces. Sometimes it takes 11 years, but it surfaces. I moved to a small house in Bethel Park in 2023. It has a yard that gets good light in the afternoon. I have a dog named Biscuit. Her official name is Margaret, after my aunt, but she came home from the rescue looking like a biscuit, and that was that. I cook dinner most nights, and I sit at my own kitchen table with my own budget on my own spreadsheet, and I know precisely what every number means. The thing I now understand, in the way that is only possible on the other side of something, is that I was never the problem in my marriage. I was never insufficient, never driving anyone toward anything, never the kind of woman whose pasta salad justifies contempt. I was a person who trusted well and was used for it, and there is a significant difference between those two things. If something in this story is sitting with you, I'd be glad for you to follow along here, and even more glad to hear what you took from it. My name is Clara Mercer. I am 42 years old. I buried an empty casket for a man who had moved 40 miles away with the money he stole from our life. And I am the one still standing. There were no children, not for lack of wanting. We tried for 3 years, quietly, with a particular tenderness that couples pour into something they cannot yet name as grief. By 2007 we had stopped trying, without ever formally deciding to stop. We did not discuss it much. Daniel said it would happen when it was meant to happen. I held on to that. What I did not hold on to, what I could not have known to hold on to, was the version of my husband that existed before I met him. His family was from McMurray, in Peters Township. His parents, Gerald and Nadine Mercer, lived in the same split-level house they had moved into in 1979. Gerald was a retired machinist. Nadine ran the household with the precision of someone who had decided long ago that the world's problems were best managed by controlling everything within arm's reach. She had the kind of smile that appeared at the exact moment it was socially required and disappeared just as quickly. She called her son Danny and called me Clara in a way that always sounded like a mild correction. Daniel was the youngest of 3. His sister, Brenda, 12 years older, lived in Morgantown, West Virginia, and had been largely absent from family gatherings since a falling out in the mid-90s that no one ever fully explained. To me, his brother, Keith, lived 6 miles from the family home in Peters Township and had dinner with Gerald and Nadine every Sunday. Keith had a wife named Tracy and 2 boys and a landscaping business, and the specific ease of a man who had never been required to justify his presence anywhere. He was the one Nadine called first with news. He was the one whose opinions were relayed as facts. I understood, within the first year of my marriage, that Daniel had spent his entire life in orbit around Keith's approval and had learned to present the appearance of contentment while doing it. I also understood, though I could not have articulated it at the time, that Daniel's relationship with money was not the same as mine. He was not reckless. He was something more dangerous than reckless. He was methodical about it. The legal pad budget, the separate savings account he opened in 2006 that I knew about but never questioned, because he said it was for a possible down payment on a rental property. The way he managed every significant purchase himself, always with cash or with a check he wrote from the joint account, before I had time to register the transaction. I was not excluded. Exactly, I was simply not included. And because I was raised by a woman who believed that trust was the foundation of a marriage and that questioning your husband's financial decisions was a form of accusation, I told myself that the arrangement was practical, that Daniel was good with money, that there was nothing behind the yellow legal pad but arithmetic. That was my mistake. And for 11 years, I paid for it. The first thing I want to tell you about the accumulation of a long deception is that it does not arrive as a single large event. It arrives as a series of moments you file away in separate rooms of your mind, and you do not realize they are all doors in the same house until one of them won't open. The first room I filed away was in the fall of 2006. We were at Gerald and Nadine's house for a Sunday dinner in October. The table was set for 8. Gerald, Nadine, Keith, Tracy, their 2 boys Ryan and Connor, Daniel, and me. Nadine had made pot roast and the kitchen smelled of bay leaves and something caramelized and good. I had brought a lemon pound cake because it was Nadine's birthday week, and because I had learned, in 3 years of these dinners, that arriving with something handmade was the closest I could get to being considered thoughtful by her. The conversation turned to money in the way it always did at that table, sideways, through the back door of other topics. Keith mentioned that a competitor's landscaping business had gone under. Gerald said something about the housing market. Then Nadine looked at Daniel across the table and said, in a voice as pleasant as a form letter, "Danny, Keith mentioned you've been having some trouble at Target, that the regional numbers are down." I looked at Daniel. He was cutting his pot roast. He did not look up. "Numbers fluctuate," he said. Keith said the Pittsburgh region was the worst performing in the quarter. Nadine reached for her water glass. "Is Clara aware of that?" I felt the table go quiet in the particular way tables go quiet when everyone is pretending they haven't been waiting for this moment. "Clara and I talk about everything," Daniel said. He looked up then and met my eyes. His expression was level. I smiled, because smiling was the correct response when you were being publicly tested in a room full of people who were hoping you would flinch. I did not flinch, but I drove home that night, asking questions I should have asked 6 months earlier. The regional numbers were down. By how much? He told me 14%. He said it was industry-wide, not personal performance. He said it would stabilize. It did not stabilize. I know now that by October of 2006, Daniel had already opened the first of what would eventually be 4 accounts I did not know about, but I did not know that then. What I knew was that the yellow legal pad had become harder to find when I looked for it, and that Daniel had started conducting phone calls in the car. The second room was the spring of 2008. By that point, the recession was arriving the way bad weather arrives. You could see it on the horizon for months before it actually hit. Target Surface Solutions was cutting the Pittsburgh regional team. Daniel was not laid off, but his territory was restructured, and his base salary dropped from $71,000 to $58,000. He told me this on a Tuesday evening over dinner, very calmly. the way he told me most things, and I received it the same way I received most things, with practicality, with the immediate calculus of adjustment. We would cut the restaurant budget. We would defer the deck renovation we had been planning. We would be fine. What I did not know was that we were already not fine. That by the spring of 2008, Daniel had accumulated $43,000 in a personal account at a credit union in Canonsburg under a slight variant of his name, Daniel R. Mercer, instead of Daniel Ray Mercer, and that he had been making deposits into that account, with money redirected from the joint checking, through a series of small transfers that individually looked like nothing. I found a credit union statement once, in April of 2008. It was in the pocket of a jacket I pulled from the closet to take to the dry cleaner. The name on the statement was Daniel R. Mercer. The balance shown was $12,400. I asked him about it that evening. Calmly, without accusation, he said it was an old account from before we were married, that he kept a small amount there as a personal emergency fund, that it had been sitting dormant for years and he simply hadn't closed it. He was so matter-of-fact about it, so utterly undefensive, that I believed him. I handed the statement back and let him take it, and I did not ask about it again. That was the moment I now return to most often when I trace the architecture of this story, not because it was the most dramatic moment, but because it was the moment that cost me the most, compounded over 11 years. There is one detail in that statement I didn't register properly at the time. I would understand it much later. The third room was the summer of 2010. By 2010, Daniel's professional trajectory had recovered somewhat. He had moved to a regional director role at a smaller commercial interiors firm called Milestone Contract Floors, based in Canonsburg. The salary was $66,000, and there was a performance bonus structure. He seemed energized by the new role. He worked long hours, which I understood. He traveled several days a month for client meetings, which I understood. He began to disengage from our social life, our dinners out, our conversations that had once stretched past midnight. I told myself this was the cost of professional reinvention, and that it was temporary. Nadine hosted a 4th of July gathering that year. 40 guests, mostly Mercer family, friends and neighbors, a few people from Keith's business circle. It was hot and the backyard smelled like lighter fluid and citronella candles. Someone had strung lights along the fence line. It would have been pleasant if I had been a different kind of guest. Daniel was talking to a group of men near the grill. I was at the folding table helping Nadine set out the side dishes. She did not ask for my help. I offered it because standing alone by the hydrangea bushes had felt worse. She looked at the pasta salad I had brought and said, loudly enough for the 3 women nearest us to hear, "Is that store-bought?" "I made it this morning," I said. "It tastes like the pasta salad from Giant Eagle," she said. She did not look at me when she said it. She was arranging a tray of deviled eggs with a precision that suggested every element of this gathering was under her personal authority. Danny grew up eating real food. One of the women nearby laughed, a short, private laugh, quickly suppressed. Another woman looked at her shoes. I said, "I'll remember that for next time," and moved to the other end of the table. The thing about being publicly diminished is that the cruelty works best when it is small enough to deny. Nadine could have said she didn't mean it that way. She would have said she didn't mean it that way, if pressed. But she had not pressed. She had moved on to the deviled eggs, and left the comment in the air, like smoke. I told Daniel about it in the car on the way home. He was quiet for a moment and then said, "She's just like that. She's not trying to be mean." That was the first time I understood that he was not going to choose me in those moments. Not because he didn't love me, but because choosing me would have required him to stand in opposition to something he had decided, at some point before I knew him, that he would not oppose. I did not cry. I looked out the window at the highway and made a note in the part of my mind where I kept the things I was not ready to do anything about yet. The 4th room was March of 2012, and this was the one that changed the frame. I had come home early from work, a half day for a routine dental appointment. Daniel's car was in the driveway, which was unusual for a Wednesday afternoon. I went into the house and found him at the kitchen table, with his laptop open and his phone face down, and an expression on his face that I had never seen before. Not guilt, something more calculated than guilt. He said he was working from home. He said it was a client issue he was handling remotely. He closed the laptop as he said this, which I noticed, and which I said nothing about. I went upstairs to change my clothes. As I came back down, I passed the kitchen again, and he was on the phone, speaking quietly. I heard 4 words before he heard me on the stairs. "I know. Not yet." He looked up. Our eyes met. He kept his face very still. I went into the living room and sat down with a magazine I did not read for the next 45 minutes, until he came in and said the client issue was resolved, and asked what I wanted to do for dinner. I said, "Whatever you want." He chose Thai. We ate at the table and talked about a home improvement show we had been watching, and I was so aware of the 4 words suspended between us that I could barely taste my food. But I did not ask, because asking, I understood by then, would get me a version of the truth that was shaped to be sufficient, and I was beginning to suspect that sufficient was no longer enough. What I did not know that evening, and would not know for another 4 years, was that Daniel had been maintaining a second life in Washington County for approximately 18 months. A woman named Susan Kowalski, who went by Susie, lived in a townhouse in South Strabane Township. She was 34 years old. She had a job at a dental office in Canonsburg. She believed she was in a relationship with a man named Ray Mercer, who traveled frequently for work and was in the process of a difficult divorce. He had been practicing the story of his own disappearance for longer than I knew. October 14, 2012 was a Sunday. Daniel went for a run in the morning, which he had done on Sunday mornings for as long as I had known him. He kissed me on the forehead before he left. I was sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and the newspaper. Biscuit was asleep on the tile near the back door. The morning had the thin gold light of October in Pennsylvania, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look preserved. He did not come home. His running shoes were found on the bank of the Allegheny River near the Washington Crossing boat launch at 11:42 that morning by a man walking his dog. His car was in the parking lot. His phone was in his car, locked in the center console. His wallet and house keys were in the cup holder. There was a note on a folded piece of yellow Lycopad paper. And yes, I have thought about that detail every day since. There were 11 words in Daniel's handwriting. "I'm sorry. I can't do this anymore. Please forgive me." The Allegheny was searched for 4 days. They found nothing. I was informed by a detective named Paulson at 9:17 that evening. I remember the specific quality of that hour. The way the light in the living room felt wrong. Too bright. The wrong temperature. Biscuit whining at the door because I had forgotten to feed her. I sat on the floor next to the coffee table for a long time after Detective Paulson left. Not crying, just sitting with the weight of it, which was not grief exactly. Not yet. Because grief requires the certainty of loss, and what I had been given was not certainty. It was a note on a legal pad, and a pair of running shoes, and an empty river. His family arrived the next morning. Keith and Tracy. Gerald, who had aged 10 years in the hours between hearing the news and walking through my front door. Nadine sat in my living room for 6 hours that first day. She did not make eye contact with me for most of it. She spoke to the detective who came to collect a formal statement, as though I were not in the room. When she left that evening, she stood in my doorway and said, quietly, not cruelly, which was somehow worse, "I always knew something like this would happen." I did not ask her what she meant. I let her walk to Keith's car. I closed the door. The search was officially called off on October 18th. The county coroner's office told me that, in the absence of a body, a death certificate would require a 5-year waiting period under Pennsylvania law, unless I petitioned the court for an undie earlier declaration. I told them I understood. I did not hold a funeral. I held a memorial service at the Bridgeville United Methodist Church on October 27th. 62 people attended. Nadine sat in the front row. She had chosen the hymns without asking me. At the reception at my house afterward, as I was standing in my own kitchen putting out the food that 14 different women had brought and quietly thanking each of them, Nadine said to the group of 8 women nearest her, her sister, 2 of her friends, Tracy, and 3 women from the church, in a voice that carried across the room like a bell, she probably drove him to it. 23 people were in that room. I counted later. because I needed to assign a number to the thing that had just happened to me in my own house, over my dead husband's memorial reception food, on the worst day I had ever lived through. I set down the foil lid I was peeling off a casserole dish. I turned and looked at Nadine. She met my eyes. She did not look away, and she did not recant, and she did not apologize. I said nothing. I turned back to the casserole dish. The room had gone as quiet as a held breath. Then someone spoke and the air moved again, and the moment passed into the walls of my kitchen, where it lived for a very long time. That was the breaking point. Not the public moment of it, the private decision that followed. I want to be precise about what happened next, because the version of this that lives in my head is not the version of a woman who fell apart. I fell apart later, that is true, in the first months after October 14th, 2012. I moved through my days with the particular efficiency of someone who has placed grief in a container and set the container on a high shelf where she can see it, but doesn't have to open it. I went back to work in November. I filed the necessary paperwork with the county. I spoke to an attorney named Patricia Holloway at a practice in Carnegie about the legal architecture of a spouse who disappears without a body, the death certificate timeline, the estate questions, the mortgage on the Oakdale Road house, which was in both our names but which I had been paying alone since the moment his running shoes turned up on the riverbank. Patricia was blunt and kind in equal measure. She told me that under Pennsylvania law I could petition the Orphans' Court for a declaration of presumed death after a period, demonstrating that diligent search had been completed, that no evidence of life had been found, and that the circumstances supported the presumption. The standard waiting period was 5 to 7 years. She said if I chose to wait the full period, I would have the strongest possible legal foundation. She said if I needed to move forward sooner, for financial reasons, we could explore a petition. I told her I would wait. I told her I was not in a hurry. What I did not tell her, what I barely admitted to myself at the time, was that something felt wrong in a way I could not articulate. Not grief. Wrong. Wrong in the way a room feels wrong when something has been moved and you can't identify what. I thought about the credit union statement I had handed back without asking a second question. I thought about the 4 words on the stairs. I thought about the yellow legal pad note. That 11 words did not seem adequate to summarize a marriage of 9 years. I put Biscuit in my lap and I looked at the ceiling of my living room and I thought, if he is dead, I will grieve when I'm ready. And if he is not dead, I will know eventually. And either way, I am going to know everything. That decision, made quietly, alone, in a house that still smelled like another person's presence, was the beginning of everything that happened next. I did not explode. I did not perform. I made one phone call. Her name was Margaret Vasquez, my aunt, my mother's younger sister by 7 years. The woman who had taught me to drive in the parking lot of a shuttered Kmart when I was 15 and had, also, in the years since, built a small but serious career as a licensed private investigator operating out of a 2-room office in Monroeville. Maggie, as she was universally known, was 54 years old in 2012. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck and drank coffee from a thermos she refilled 3 times a day, and had a way of listening that reminded me of my mother. The same quality of complete attention, with the addition of a professional's instinct for the detail that doesn't fit. I called her on November 3rd, 2012, 16 days after the memorial service. I told her everything: the credit union statement, the 4 words on the stairs, the yellow legal pad budget that had become harder to find. The Sunday in July 2010, when I had overheard a conversation he had with Keith about a property investment that he had never mentioned to me. Not a rental property, a different thing. An LLC that Keith had said he thought Daniel had closed out. I had not known Daniel had an LLC. I had never been told about it. Maggie listened to all of it without interruption. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Clara, I want you to understand that what you're asking me to look into has a range of possible outcomes." I told her I understood that. She said, "Including the one where he's really gone." I said, "I know, I need to find out." She charged me her standard rate of $85 an hour, plus expenses. Over the 11 years that followed, the total cost of Maggie's work on this case would reach $44,200. I do not regret a dollar of it. She began with the financials, using information I provided: social security number, date of birth, known account history, and her access to skip tracing databases through her PI license. Maggie began constructing a picture of Daniel's financial activity in the years leading up to his disappearance. What emerged over the following months was meticulous and damning. The credit union account in Canonsburg, the one I had handed back without a second question in 2008, had not been dormant. Between 2006 and 2012, Daniel had made 214 deposits into that account, totaling $87,400. The deposits were structured never more than $4,900 at a time, which placed them just below the $5,000 threshold at which bank employees are trained to ask questions. The money came from the joint checking account through a series of small transfers and occasional cash withdrawals that, viewed month by month, looked like ordinary domestic expenses. Viewed across 6 years, they were a construction project. By October 2012, the balance in the Canonsburg Credit Union account was $91,200. The LLC was real. It had been formed in 2009 under the name Mercer Consulting Group, LLC, registered with the Pennsylvania Department of State. The registered agent was not Daniel. It was a man named Thomas Gowell, a connection Maggie traced to Keith Mercer's landscaping business network. The LLC had been used primarily to receive and redirect proceeds from a small portfolio of freelance, commercial flooring consulting work Daniel had been doing since 2010, work that supplemented his milestone contract, floors, salary, and that had generated approximately $38,000 over 3 years, none of which had passed through the joint checking account. The total Maggie could document, in accounts and assets Daniel had accumulated outside of our shared financial life, was $147,600. And then there was Susan Kowalski, of South Strabane Township. Maggie found her in the spring of 2013, 6 months into the investigation. Through a combination of cell phone records from a secondary number Maggie had identified through the LLC's registration, documents and careful surveillance work that I will not detail here, because some of what she did existed at the edges of what her license permitted, and she was protecting me by doing it. Susan Kowalski, 34 years old, a dental receptionist. A woman who had been told that the man she was seeing was named Ray Mercer, that he was in the commercial flooring business, that he traveled frequently, and that his marriage had been troubled for years and was in the process of ending. She had a photograph of him on her Instagram that had since been removed. In the photograph, which Maggie saved before it disappeared, Daniel was wearing a jacket I had bought him for Christmas in 2009, and smiling the way he used to smile when he was relaxed and comfortable, and his arm was around a woman with dark hair and a good, honest face who looked at the camera with the uncomplicated happiness of someone who believed she was loved. He had walked away from the river. He had walked directly toward her. What Maggie could not find in 2013, 2014, or 2015 was where he was. Susan Kowalski had last used her Instagram account in November of 2012. She had moved out of the South Strabane Township townhouse in late October of 2012, within 2 weeks of the river incident. Her forwarding address went to a P.O. box in Canonsburg. The trail went cold in a way that suggested preparation, not accident. They had planned the exit together. I absorbed this information across a series of phone calls with Maggie that took place during my lunch breaks at the medical billing office in Carnegie. Sitting in my car in the parking garage, with the engine off and a legal pad on my lap, where I wrote down everything she said. I did not scream. I did not throw anything. I held the phone to my ear and wrote down numbers and names and dates and told Maggie each time, "Keep going." There was something I hadn't understood yet, a piece of the geography that would only become clear later. I wrote it at the bottom of one of the pages. Where did they go? The answer came 11 years after I sat on the floor next to my coffee table with the wrong temperature living room light. By 2018, the 5-year legal waiting period had passed, and Patricia Holloway had successfully petitioned the court for a declaration of presumed death. I received a death certificate for Daniel Ray Mercer, dated September 12, 2018. I was legally a widow. The Oakdale Roadhouse had been sold in 2016. I had moved to a rental apartment in MT Lebanon. The medical billing job had become a practice manager position and then a regional operations role, and my salary had grown from $44,000 to $79,000. I had kept Biscuit until she died of old age, in 2017. I had not remarried. I had not stopped paying Maggie. She found them in 2021. It was a property record search, the kind of painstaking cross-referencing that produces nothing for months and then produces everything at once. Maggie had been running searches on variations of the name Ray Mercer, Daniel R. Mercer, D. Ray Mercer, across multiple counties in Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. In 2021, a deed transfer in Peters Township, Washington County, Pennsylvania, recorded a property at 441 Whitfield Drive as being purchased by one Raymond D. Mercer and Susan Ann Mercer for $268,000. Peters Township, Washington County, 40 miles from Bridgeville, 40 miles from the house on Oakdale Road, 40 miles from the bank of the Allegheny River where his running shoes had been placed on a morning in October when the Noaked light was thin and gold. Maggie called me on a Wednesday afternoon. I was at my desk. She said, "Clara." I said, "You found him." She said, "I found him." The silence between us on the phone lasted perhaps 5 seconds. Then I said, "Tell me everything." Raymond D. Mercer and Susan Ann Mercer had married in June of 2015 in a small ceremony in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. They had lived in a series of rental properties in Washington County before purchasing the Whitfield Drive house. He was employed as a regional director at a commercial interiors firm, a different one from Milestone, a smaller company called Allied Interior Solutions. He drove a dark blue Ford F-150. He and Susan attended the same Baptist church in Canonsburg that had married them by proxy when a local pastor there filed their marriage certificate. He had told the church community that he was a widower. He had not died. He had simply relocated his life 40 miles to the southwest and constructed a second version of it, with the money he had spent 6 years building a wall of secret accounts to fund. His name, the legal name on the deed, on the marriage certificate, on the employment records, Maggie traced, was Raymond D. Mercer. His middle name was actually Ray. He had not created a false identity. He had simply shifted which name he used. The way a man steps from one room into another and pulls the door behind him, he was alive. He was, by all visible evidence, thriving. I sat at my desk for a long time after I ended the call with Maggie. I looked at the wall in front of me, which had a framed print of a Winslow Homer painting I had bought at the Carnegie Museum of Art the summer after the Cole Memorial Service. I thought about all the mornings I had woken up in the years since 2012, and assembled myself for the day, and gone to work and managed the grief of a death that had not happened. I thought about Nadine's voice in my kitchen. She probably drove him to it. I picked up the phone and called Patricia Holloway. I told her I had evidence that my husband was alive. There was a pause on her end. Then she said, in the measured tone of a woman who had spent 30 years in family law, "Clara, this changes everything." We moved carefully. Patricia was explicit about the importance of sequence. Document everything before making any contact or public disclosure. Because once Daniel, or Raymond, as he now called himself, knew we had found him, the clock would start, and so would his lawyers. Maggie spent October and November of 2021 compiling a comprehensive documented report, the property records, the marriage certificate, the employment history, photographs taken from public spaces, business registration, documents, and a cross-reference financial timeline showing the relationship between the accounts he had drained before his disappearance and the life he had constructed afterward. The compiled report was 214 pages. Patricia retained a forensic accountant named David Chung, whose firm was based in Pittsburgh, to review and certify the financial documentation. David worked from late November 2021 through February 2022. His analysis confirmed that Daniel had redirected a minimum of $147,600 for marital assets in the period between 2006 and 2012, and that the LLC, Mercer Consulting Group, had received an additional $38,000 in income that had never been disclosed. To me, his certified report put the total at $189,400, including interest calculated at the applicable Pennsylvania legal rate. There was also the matter of the fraudulently obtained death certificate, which Patricia flagged for the Allegheny County District Attorney's Office in January of 2022. She was careful about this. Not a phone call, but a formal written submission with supporting documentation sent certified mail to the DA's office and copied to the Pennsylvania State Police. The relevant charges, she explained to me, could include insurance fraud, if any life insurance claim had been made, identity fraud, bigamy under 18 pascals, CSC 4301. Because Daniel had married Susan Kowalski while legally married to me, and theft by deception for the marital asset, misappropriation. I had not had a life insurance policy on Daniel, which was a fact I had only ever thought about with sadness in the years after 2012. In 2022, I thought about it differently. It meant he had not committed insurance fraud, because I had given him nothing to defraud. It also meant the absence of an insurance claim had helped him stay invisible for 11 years. The bigamy charge was the cleanest. Under Pennsylvania law, if a person contracts marriage while an existing marriage is still legally valid, they have committed bigamy. Daniel's legal marriage to me had never been dissolved. I had obtained a death certificate, but that was a civil presumption, not a divorce. His marriage to Susan, in June of 2015, had been conducted while our marriage was legally intact. The DA's office opened an investigation in March of 2022. I was interviewed by a detective named Reyes on March 15th. I brought Maggie's 4-page report and David Chung's certified financial analysis. Detective Reyes was thorough and unhurried. The interview lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. I want to be precise about the moment I understood that this was no longer just mine. It was the moment Detective Reyes slid the financial summary across the table, studied it for a moment, looked up at me, and said, "Mr. Mercer, I want to make sure I understand the timeline correctly. He built this account structure over 6 years while living in the marital home." I said yes, she said, "and the total is documented at $189,400. I said, "Yes, plus 11 years of interest." She looked back at the summary. "And he's been living 40 miles away." It was not a question. She said it the way you say something when the weight of it is still settling. I said, 40 miles away, with a new wife, and a house they paid $268,000 for. Reyes looked up at me again. She said, "We'll be in touch." Meanwhile, Patricia had also filed an Allegheny County Civil Court to vacate the 2018 death certificate and to commence a civil action for equitable distribution of marital assets, fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The case was assigned to Judge Miriam Caldwell of the Allegheny County Court of Common Pleas, and Maggie, who had been tracking Raymond D. Mercer's professional activities as part of her documentation work, had identified that Allied Interior Solutions held an annual regional industry trade dinner every April at the Omni William Penn Hotel in downtown Pittsburgh. That dinner was on April 7, 2022. I want to be precise about the sequence of the night of April 7th, because what happened has been described in various ways by various people, and precision is the only thing I have ever had that they couldn't take from me. The dinner was a trade event. Registered attendees included vendors, contractors, and commercial interiors professionals from across the tri-state region. Allied Interior Solutions had a table of 12. The dinner was not closed to the public. With a $175 ticket, anyone in the industry could attend. Maggie had attended these dinners before, as a vendor representative for a flooring accessories company she occasionally did work for. She purchased 2 tickets. I want to be clear. I did not go to that dinner to create a scene. I went to that dinner because I had spent 20 years, 9 married, 11 quietly building a case, and I wanted to be present when the case became real. We arrived at 6:15. The Omni William Penn ballroom was set for 220 guests. The chandeliers were enormous. The tablecloths were white. The room smelled like warm bread and the particular crisp, the pressure of air conditioning in a formal space. Maggie was wearing a blue blazer and her reading glasses on their chain. I was wearing a gray dress I had bought specifically for this evening, chosen because it was professional and unremarkable, and the last thing anyone in that room would remember about me after the evening was over. I saw Daniel at 7:12. He was at the Allied Interior Solutions table across the room, standing with a group of colleagues in the informal, pre-dinner conversation that precedes the seating. He had aged in 11 years, broader through the shoulders, gray at the temples, a beard he had not had in Bridgeville. He was wearing a dark blue blazer, and he was laughing at something a man next to him had said, the loose, comfortable laugh of a man who has nothing to fear in the room peas. Standing in, I looked at him for approximately 10 seconds. Then I sat down at my table. The dinner proceeded. The salads came. The entrees came. A man named Hargrove from the event organizing committee gave a brief address about industry trends. Awards were presented for regional performance. Daniel Raymond, as he was listed in the program, received a recognition certificate for his team's Q4 numbers. He walked to the front of the room, accepted the certificate, said something self-deprecating and charming to a smattering of applause, and walked back to his table. At 9:17, as the dessert plates were being cleared, a uniformed Pennsylvania State Police officer and a plainclothes detective entered the ballroom from the eastern door. They crossed the room with the unhurried deliberateness of people who already know where they're going. They stopped at the Allied Interior Solutions table. The detective said something to Daniel that I could not hear from my table. Daniel's posture changed. Not dramatically, just slightly. A small, precise deflation. Like the moment you realize the thing you've been afraid of has finally arrived and there's nothing left to do about it. He looked across the room. I do not know if he saw me. I was watching from the distance of 20 tables. But if he saw me, what he saw was a woman in a gray dress sitting very still, with her hands folded in front of her, looking back at him with an expression that I can only describe as, I know exactly who you are.